Hi, you're listening to Java with Jen with your host, Jenilee Samuel. On this show, I bring the simplicity of hearing God's voice into everyday life in a no-nonsense, authentic, and super practical way. With coffee in hand and real life in our faces, let's do this. Hey everybody, thanks so much for coming back to another episode here at Java with Jen. I have an honored, esteemed guest with us today. His name is Mr. Scot McKnight. Some of you may know of him because he is a prolific author. He is a professor, a theologian. He's well known in Christian circles, many Christian circles, but one of his, I don't know if it's a super recent book, but one of his books that for me is a recent find is A Church Called Tov. And that's the one we're going to focus in on today, which is about how to replace and heal from toxic church culture and bring in healthier church culture. And Tov is the word that means good. It's the Hebrew word good. And so we're going to dive into that. But just so that you understand who Scot is, for any of you who may be new to who he is, he's a professor of the New Testament at Houston Theological Seminary in Houston, Texas, and at Westminster Theological Center in the UK. He's been a professor for more than 40 years and has authored many books, most of his career concentrating on the study of Jesus in his Jewish context. Alongside that academic orientation, Scot has written books for church folks, including The Jesus Creed, as well as A Church Called Tov and Pivot. The latter two books written with his daughter, Laura Barringer. So, Scot, thank you so much for coming today.
Well, Jenilee and Stephen, good to be with you.
Absolutely. Now, okay, so a little backstory to what brought this interview. It's kind of fun. My husband's 47th birthday was here in January, and I was, after you've had so many birthdays together, it's like, what do you do for someone who can just buy whatever they need, right? And so I was asking the Lord for an idea, and I had the thought to invite one of Stephen's favorite authors, thus Scot McKnight, to the show, and he was so kind and gracious to say, yes, I'm happy to carve out some time for you. So that's the backstory. So Stephen is my co-host today. So welcome, Stephen, to the show as well. Okay, so Scot, we're going to dive right in. I want to make the best use of our time. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what put this topic of toxic church culture on your heart in such a way that you felt the need to write a book about it? What put this on your radar?
Well, what happened is we were longtime attenders, about a decade, of Willow Creek, where Bill Hybels was the pastor. And we got to know some of the people, not as friends, but we knew more about them than probably most. And I was sitting on my back porch one evening, and saw an email in my inbox from the Chicago Tribune that a story was being written about Willow Creek and Bill Hybels. And so I sat there and read it. It was an extensive piece by a very highly respected journalist, Manya Bashir Pashman, I think. And I told Chris as I started, I said, there's something big coming out about Willow Creek. And then I read it and I said, the witnesses that are involved here are very believable, and they're people we know mostly, and this is serious stuff. So I wrote my daughter, Laura Barringer, and she was out to dinner, and then when they came home from dinner, they read the article, and then we talked extensively that night. It was late for us. And then over the next 6 weeks or so, month, we talked back and forth. I wouldn't say every day. I don't remember now the details like that, but it was frequent. And I finally sat down just to get my thoughts together. I was in an airport, and I sat down with my computer, and I wrote out, a couple pages of my thoughts about what was going on. Then I went to Europe on a tour with students. When I came back, I wrote to Laura and asked her what was going on with the Willow story. She said, nothing, it's getting worse. So I said, okay, I'm going to try to put my hand in the game here and write this blog post. And it went viral. And it was an evaluation, not so much a critique and judgment, that the stories are true by these women. They're not lying. And we need to start talking about more goodness in a church. And people resonated with this word goodness. And I was teaching not long after that, and I started to use the Hebrew word tov in classes, and students resonated with this. And I didn't really tell my daughter much about this because she wanted me to write about Willow Creek more and more. Then she said, Dad, you need to write a book. And I said, no, I want to write a book about Revelation. And Stephen mentioned that before we started. And well, make a long story short, eventually we did agree with the publisher to write about this. And I told Laura, my daughter, if we're going to write about this, it has to be in a redemptive direction. I'm not a reporter. I'm not a historian of American evangelical megachurches. I'm not going to get access to records at Willow Creek and their files and everything else. So I said, I just want to write a redemptive book. And so what we did is we started with characteristics of toxic churches that we began to notice. And then I said, instead of just countering these, in a kind of fakey way with the fruit of the Spirit, I said, let's just see what the opposite would be if it was Tov. And so we took toxic culture marks and flipped the script and found Tov culture marks. And that's how the book was written. And I have to tell you that at the beginning, it was sort of 50-50. Every chapter was about half description of toxicity and half description of Tov. And the editor said, no, we're going to shove most of the toxicity up in the front of the book. And as the book moves on, it's going to become increasingly about Tov. And that was a very, very helpful move by our editor. And so we're thankful to Dave for what he did. And I guess that's the question you asked me because that's the answer I gave.
That's good. That's so good. And for one, I remember when the Willow Creek thing went down because it was a pretty big church, right?
Oh yeah, 25,000 people.
Oh yeah. So there's a chance that some of them might end up listening to this. Who knows? And so for one, I hate that you guys had to walk through that because I mean, we've been in ministry long enough and we've known enough people who have been in ministry that, we're all just trying to love Jesus better. And it really stinks when you're trying to do that in community and the community is just as harmful as anything that we experience in life. That's hard. And so what is your hope for people in reading your book, like as you were writing it? And I'm sure that, whenever anyone creates something, there's a vision in their heart for what good it's going to do. What is your hope? What is your vision for people as they encounter your book?
Well, this is a good question because our hope, it's not like we sat down and talked about this all the time. Our hope is multifaceted. The first thing is we want to give people who are suffering in churches at the hands of abusive leaders, we want to give them words for their experiences.
Good.
And I cannot tell you, okay, I will tell you, for 16 months, we got, Laura and I and my wife, Chris, got between 3 and 5 letters a week.
Wow.
Of abuse in churches and Christian organizations. And one of the most common statements was, you've understood my experience. You've put words to what's happened to me.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one thing. The second thing is we want to draw attention to culture, church culture. Culture matters. Culture is invisible. It's like fish swimming in water who can't see the color of water. But it is deeply influential. I've been in churches where the culture of the place within an hour was constraining me in certain directions, and I don't know how it was doing that, or shaping me in directions. And we found a statement by David Brooks, who's a pretty good observer of American culture, that the longer we say work in a culture, the more that culture will make us the kind of person that fits in that culture. So if the culture is toxic and you continue to work there, the chances of you not becoming toxic are pretty low.
Yeah.
If you work for Mr. Rogers, if you worked for Mr. Rogers, the chances are that you would have become Tover just by being around Mr. Rogers, because he created that kind of culture.
Yeah.
So culture really matters. If the culture is a gossipy, complaining, backbiting, wanting to seize control, always complaining about the leaders, one person wanting to control things and getting other people on his or her side. If you continue to work there, you're just going to start participating in that toxicity. And if you resist that toxicity, you will either be denounced or you will have to leave. And this is what happens in culture. So that was a second feature. And the third is we wanted to draw attention to marks of culture that will prevent, constrain toxicities from arising. So we gave, let's say, characteristics of Tov. Now, when we were done with this, my daughter and I began to go on podcasts, and we had no idea, although I told Laura when we wrote the book, I don't want to spend my time on podcasts. And I had no idea what podcast world was actually about. I had one of my own, but I didn't pay that much attention to all others. And as I was telling you, I've been on about 250 podcasts about this project of Tov and Pivot. But when the book ended, in all the conversations, we began to be asked the question, what can we do to prevent toxicity from arising? And what can we do that will help our church culture or Christian organization form into a more Tov culture? So that's why we wrote Pivot. And I liked I suggested the title Pivot, and Laura said, no, Dad, everybody knows the scene in Friends where there is this pivot story. I said, oh, Laura. And I said, oh, Laura, nobody's heard of that. She goes, oh, Dad, everybody's heard of it. And then, but she went along with the word pivot. And then we realized from a friend that pivot, the last three letters in pivot are Tov backwards.
That's true.
And we didn't even know this when we wrote it, but we've gotten credit for our very clever title.
Oh, wow. That's really great. Okay, so let me ask one more, and I'll pass the baton over to Stephen to ask a few. But since some people may be new to the idea of like just framing church experiences like this, and so, maybe they've gone through something hard, but they just couldn't find language for it because in church, things are spiritualized. And when things are spiritualized, it oftentimes makes it very confusing to be able to call what it is, call this toxic, call that good. It can really blur the lines. So what are maybe three of the most common characteristics of toxic culture and three of the most the best characteristics of a Tov culture to combat those?
Well, the first thing I would say, so let's talk about toxicity. The first characteristic that we've noticed is, let's just say, a narcissistic type leader. And I understand that narcissism is an official diagnosis for the MMPI and the classic disciplines of psychology, but very selfish, self-aggrandizing, lacking empathy, wanting everything to be about themselves. That's one of the characteristics that has to be picked up. And Jenilee, I just want to say that we create platforms for churches that will attract people who like to be on platforms, who like to be in the front. Okay, that's the way it works. If you create a small group, I heard someone who's a pretty well-known scholar was asked to teach at a Sunday school. And he said, I will only teach if there are at least 500 people present.
Oh.
And I thought, it's a Sunday school. What are you asking about? Another person said he would only speak if he was given $5,000. And I went, okay. All right. So it attracts narcissism. A second thing is power really matters, but power is used in such a way that people are motivated by fear of the person with power. That's
Yeah.
a very
That's so good.
noticeable characteristic. And I want to emphasize, and both of you probably know this, you can't see this on Sunday morning going to
No.
church and
Mhm.
listening to music and watching these people perform on the platform.
Yeah.
This is where they are masterful and they are charming, and you think you get to know them.
Yeah.
All right. These things that are toxic are going to happen most of the time behind closed doors, unless all of a sudden there's a burst of anger and more people hear about that the person exploded. And then in most of these cases, they excuse them because they're so passionate and they're so driven that they every now and then they blow up. If you, as a basketball coach or a baseball coach, occasionally blow up at a call, I'm going to say, okay, that's what sports are like. All right. It's pretty intense. But if you're a pastor of Christian spiritual formation,
Yeah.
which all pastors ought to be,
Mhm.
then we are going to expect a little bit more out of those sorts of people.
Yeah.
All right. Now, third, this is a hard one. It is a hard one to pick for me, but a willingness to use false narratives to cover steps. In other words, to spin the story to protect the reputation of the church, which is usually the reputation of that individual pastor more than the church, because the church and the pastor are so identified that if the pastor goes down, the church goes down. If the church goes down, the pastor goes down.
Wow.
So those are three
Yeah.
major characteristics. That's what I would look for.
Yeah.
I don't think you can find these on Sunday morning, and you're going to have to find these from people who are willing to tell the truth, and you're going to have to be the journalist who ends up covering the underground of a place rather than the surface of a place.
So
Yeah.
would you say it's mostly the staff and the volunteers that work closer with the pastor that experience that?
Yeah.
They will experience it. The closer the person is to the inner circle, these people always have an inner circle, the more likely that the inner people will see it. And in the last 3 years, I think this book came out in 2021. Maybe it was 2022. I don't know. That's the people who have contacted us. It's people who are faithful to the church, successful in a sense in the church. They've risen as leaders, as potential influencers in the church. And as they get closer to the inside, they begin to see things. And this is where the tension arises. They love the affirmation. They love the opportunity to serve. They love their newfound status in this community. They get to be on the platform. People know them. People are talking about them. And then they begin to see things. They can excuse the person. They can offer alternative explanations that he was just having a bad day. But at some point, many of these people say, this person is not healthy. And how did we get here? And how did I get in this position?
Yeah. Wow. And so what would be the three opposing characteristics that are Tov qualities?
Okay, the opposite of a narcissist is a person who's empathic and sympathetic. Narcissists have no feelings for other people. They don't care. As long as that person supports them like a sycophant, they're perfectly happy with them. The minute they criticize them, they live in a world of shame, and the one thing they don't want to be is wrong or discovered as inadequate. That's what they don't care about other people. They care about themselves.
Yeah.
So an empathic person will create a culture of compassion toward other people around them. The people around them will say, oh, he's so caring, or she's so caring. And there's a culture that develops. And over time, you begin to see it creeps into the whole church. And frankly, a lot of these churches don't succeed as well as other churches because they're not as driven by the glory of the platform. A second characteristic is great. It's great, filled with grace.
Mm.
Grace as forgiveness. I mean, I know countless stories. I've heard countless stories of people making a mistake on the platform, wearing the wrong thing, showing up a few minutes late, and they are humiliated. They are reprimanded in front of everyone. And there's just no grace for someone to learn the skills that are needed for a given position in the church.
Yeah.
And then instead of false narratives, these people are recognized for being truth tellers.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean by that blasting away at people.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean is that they do the right thing at the right time. And when you say that wasn't right, to say that to that person, they say thank you and they apologize. They apologize to those people. They apologize. They tell the truth and they allow the light to shine in their inner darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And that inner light has a capacity to heal and to blow out the darkness.
Yeah.
So
that's really good.
Those are,
So,
that's really good. Go ahead, Stephen. I know you've got some questions lined up.
so I think, and of course on our list, what should members do when they realize they're in a church culture? Because I think one of the key things of why people join a church community, we'd love to say it's because they love Jesus, but the truth is they are connected with people in the church community. So you can have maybe not a great worship team, maybe not a great pastor, but they're connected with families in the church, their kids or friends and things like that. They're connected in church. So when they recognize they're in a toxic culture, I think a lot of times, just by virtue of trying to be honorable, trying to be respectful of authority, and of course the gravity of, this is a spiritual leader, we don't talk about them, we don't gossip, we don't slander. Like, how would someone recognize, as they recognize a church culture is toxic, how should they proceed in addressing that situation?
this is a big one.
I was saying, is that a big can of worms right there?
It's a big one. Well, yes, it's a can of worms. But the first thing that we tell people is don't do anything unless you're in a healed state yourself.
Okay.
Because the minute you go forward, it's going to be a lot of blowback. Okay.
Yeah.
So the first thing is, what is your, let's just say, your emotional, psychological, and spiritual condition right now? Right. The second thing is, I think you should talk to a therapist before you talk to anybody else. Now, if you don't have a therapist, talk to someone who's a really good friend, who's wise, not someone who's angry all the time, but someone who's wise, who can say, I don't think that issue is so important, but I do think this issue that you're concerned about is more important. Let's focus on one thing. They offer wisdom at that. The third thing is, without trying to create a situation of gossip, keep your eyes open to see if you think there are other people who might have similar ideas.
Yeah.
In other words, you might look to find out if some people who are in your position have also left the church. And you might want to have coffee with them to express that you miss them, that you care about them, you wonder if things are okay, and almost always they're going to start talking. So you might find some people who are with you on this.
Yeah.
Because you're gonna feel like you're alone, because this is the way these people work, is they keep people sheltered from where the bad relations are. And then I would, if you are overly intimidated, you may not be able to talk to the senior pastor, or you might not be able to talk to that person. You want to find someone who is safe, that you can talk to on the inside of the inner circle of the church and say, I have a concern about this with this situation. What do you recommend that I do? All right. Now here's a big point. Don't expect to succeed. Don't expect that if you say, this pastor is intimidating people and scaring people away from the gospel. And he's hurt and wounded a lot of people, and he's giving a false impression on the platform. Don't expect that pastor to change and to say, oh, I've been sinning and I need to repent and lament my situation. This just does not happen. Ramani Durvasula has a new book. I think it's called It's Not You. It's Not About You. Let me see. It's called It's Not You. It's about what it means to work when you're working with a narcissist. Mm-hmm. And one of her points is narcissists do not change. Mm-hmm. Now, we like to believe in the gospel that people can be transformed.
Yeah.
But Chuck DeGroat wrote a book about narcissism in the church. And Chuck DeGroat worked with a pastor who recognized he was a narcissist. He pulled out of pastoring, and it took 10 years before he felt his personality had been redeemed and transformed enough for him to trust himself back with leading people again.
Wow.
Now, that is a redemptive story with a narcissist. Most of them drop out for a month and then they come right back in and they're the same person all over. Oh. So don't expect to succeed. Instead, expect hope to be heard.
Yeah.
And that's all the farther you're going to be able to get. Just your witness is the goal, is I want to be able to tell the right people what I've seen and pray and hope that they might do something about it.
Gotcha. Yeah. So how is this and because I'm thinking through situations that we've lived through on all sides, and by them going, because I understand, I think it's natural for us to go, am I the only one experiencing this? And kind of start paying attention. Are other people having my shared experience? But that is delicate because you don't want to turn it into where you're creating this army of people that are all offended and talking and whispering and like, do you feel like this? Do you feel like, that can become very toxic very fast. And so you have to do it really carefully and with integrity. But then at the same time, if confronting the situation may not be fruitful, is it better and healthier to just quietly draw a boundary for your own family and leave the church? I mean, where is it actually fruitful to address the situation?
I think this is the big question that we've faced in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years is the whistleblower experience is a painful experience and largely unsuccessful.
Yeah.
Okay, you have to recognize this. Those of us who've been whistleblowers know what happens. Okay, now one of the things we talk about in Pivot is to form. I think you're right. Is that, and I think I said this as well. Is that you don't want to just form a clutch of gossips who get together and complain about things. That's what happens in a toxic environment. Instead, we contend that you can form a coalition, a pocket of Tov. And that is, in this group, we are going to work on being Tov. And we're not going to spend our time criticizing the other people. Now, traumatized people have to talk about their experience, and they will talk about the experience over and over and over.
Yeah.
And it's in talking about it over and over and over that they begin to heal from the experience. I don't think a group of traumatized people is a healthy expression of Tov.
Yeah.
I think they probably need to be with a therapist or their spouse or their close friends where they can complain about these things, but they need to be pursuing Tov. So I think they can stay if they shield themselves into a pocket of Tov and just begin to practice Tov things in the context of the church where they love the Sunday morning services, or they love the music, or they love all the people. Okay? So that's a possibility. But there comes a time when you say, number one, I can no longer respect what happens on that platform because I know too much about the people on that platform. They've spoiled my capacity to trust their integrity.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's theological, but most of the time this is relational and moral or discipleship lack. And you say, I think that this is going to produce a negative culture over time, and I don't want to participate in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think some people choose to leave. You know, Paul had to separate himself from Barnabas and from John Mark. And later, you know, they join hands again.
Mm-hmm.
So there are times when it's best to leave. The goal should be ultimate reconciliation, but sometimes ultimate reconciliation is going to happen down the road rather than immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And it's too traumatizing, or what people often call triggering, to stay together in this given situation.
I agree. I definitely agree.
Okay, so I think question is, and I'll preface it with a story. So years ago, I went to a conference in Atlanta. It was an atheism, an understanding atheism conference, and it was with Rabbi Zacharias. And at the time, I was an associate pastor at a church and had a couple of missionaries. I was the missions department, and I had two missionaries have moral failures. Both of them from the Middle East region, Northern Asia, whatever region, and they both had reached this place. They were the most powerful person in the organization, their missions organization, and they had affairs, they had extramarital situations, came in the open. Of course, I'm a young pastor at the time. We're talking 10 years ago or so. And so I meet with Ravi Zacharias one-on-one at the end of the conference. And I ask him, like, what is it in the culture of these missions organizations and the church as a whole where there's an incredible lifestyle before them, teaching, books, you know, influence being built. And then all of a sudden, at the end of their life, you find out things start unraveling. What is it in our culture? Which leads to this question is like, are megachurches really a biblical pattern of how churches should look? Because it seems like they all lead to the same place. You know, no matter how great the leader is at the beginning, our American church model of megachurches keeps putting people at the top that more or less may have started out great, but they keep failing. So are we somewhat naive in thinking that the megachurch model is somehow biblical, you know?
Okay. I want to say, yes, I think this is a very serious issue and a very important question. And it's something that we ought to be talking about more than we do. Chuck DeGroat, when I talked to Chuck about narcissism, he said, Scott, anybody who gets on a platform and wants to tell people what God wants them to do is going to be on the spectrum of narcissism.
Wow.
He said, and that includes you and me, Scott, because we're professors and we're on platforms.
Yeah.
So let's just say this. There is just as big a narcissist in little churches as there are in big churches. Okay, so it's the platform that we're talking about here.
Okay.
The second thing is, I would say, is mega churches will be particularly attractive to mega egos, because the bigger the glory, the bigger the platform, the bigger the ego that has to handle this. These are huge situations.
Yeah.
Huge. Okay. The third thing is, when mega churches pastors fail, they fail with mega failures because they're so big. I'm reading a book right now by I think she's Lithuanian. It's called Disgraced. It's the history of scandals by pastors in the 19th and 20th century.
Wow.
That sounds like a depressing book.
It is depressing, but unfortunately, this is the world in which I have to live. I teach pastors. I talk about these things, and I thought, oh, this will be a good book to read. So from what I can tell, it's about one story per chapter. I haven't gotten deep enough into the book. But so there's a certain sense in which I don't think all megachurches fail at all.
Right.
But the ones that fail are so spectacular that you say, well, megachurch is the problem. I'm not quite convinced of that, because I have met some megachurch pastors with wonderful Tov character, from what I could tell, who have succeeded for a long time in the church world and have surrounded themselves with really good people, and it's a Tov culture. Right? And I've met pastors of small churches that are very egocentric and they could never succeed anywhere else because they're just mean-spirited.
Yeah.
And they just aren't going to get a big platform.
Right.
Okay. But there is a peculiar and unavoidable temptation in megachurches for the toxification. I'm going to invent a word that my father, an English teacher, would never have approved. The toxification of the character of a pastor.
Mm.
And I really think that's true, is that kind of power, that kind of glory, that kind of attention from other people, that kind of sycophantic surrounding of people who just want to adore you. Plutarch wrote a famous essay in the 2nd century on how to tell a friend from a flatterer. Flatterers rise into the inner circle of narcissistic leaders because they're looking for flatterers. But this is a very, very serious issue. And the only antidote to this is character. Character is the result of spiritual formation over time. Good Tov people recognize toxic situations better than toxic people do.
Yeah.
So Mr. Rogers would have heard something and said, that's just not sensitive. Whereas toxic narcissistic leaders don't even hear it. They don't even recognize it. They think that's right. So I do believe that megachurch situations. Oh, look, I know some megachurch pastors. I've been in some with some who fill the room with their presence, and that's not a compliment. I've been in others where I didn't even know they were there. Now, some of those are manipulative guys who just learn to hold back until they need to say what they want. But others are humble. So it's about character. And character will permeate the inner circle over time.
Yeah.
But also toxic people around you can surround you in such a way that will toxify your own character. So we need to spend time in prayer. We need to spend time with the Bible. We need to have truth tellers, not flatterers around us. I think every pastor should have a therapist,
Agreed.
a good therapist. And I think every pastor needs to have people who don't give a rip about their glory, who will tell them what they think. And
so
say things like, that illustration you gave about yourself in the last sermon, it was so self-serving. Oh, I know you were trying to do, you were virtue signaling, but you thought you were telling a story. And if you say publicly, I don't want this to be about myself, well, it is.
It becomes that way.
It is about yourself. So you can't avoid it. And so you need to have people around you who can speak like that to you.
Yeah.
Now, I have a wife who's a psychologist who's way too shrewd for me to get by with anything.
I do too.
and because I'm a professor, I've had some success as a professor, but I create classrooms. I try to create classrooms where students can disagree with me and push back. Pastors don't have that. One time I had a narcissistic pastor talk about professors who just sit there and pontificate. And I thought to myself,
wow,
you know what? That's not what happens in classrooms. Students raise their hand and disagree.
Yeah.
How many people get to raise their hand in your sermons and disagree with you?
Yeah.
And what happens? Do you listen to them?
Yeah.
Do you adjust? Do you ever say, I could be wrong on this? Do you ever say, I don't know? I need to go look at this? Are you ever wrong in board meetings? Do you ever practice the discipline of not knowing?
Yeah.
Just to say, we're going to talk about something. I don't know much about it. I need to listen to you folks. So, all right. I've said a few.
That's good.
I thought it was pretty good though.
That was really good. It was That's really good. I was over here chuckling because I was thinking on many conversations where I have been the shrewd accountability for my husband too
Yes,
when he's
that's
preaching.
my
Stephen,
theology.
go ahead and ask him this last question. I want to respect his time.
You said, for those who've experienced toxicity in the church, what are some practical steps they can take to heal and find a healthy church community? And I think you hit on that a little bit as far as
Yeah,
creating pockets of Tov.
yeah. Well, I think number one is people need to, let's say, become mindful and aware of their own feelings
Mhm.
of what's going on. And most of these people are going to need a therapist or someone who understands people really well to be able
Yeah.
to talk to, and not one time, but over time.
Hmm.
So I think the process of healing is going to begin with self-awareness and then processing that self-awareness with someone who can guide you or at least listen to you well enough to bring and ask the right questions to bring these things out of you to where you become, let's say, an agent in your own self-revelation
Yeah.
and insight. And then I think we need to surround ourselves with people who are Tov,
Mm.
who will be redemptive in our own lives and helpful. Most people who've experienced trauma, everybody who's experienced trauma is looking for safety.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's
They're
true.
trying to find a place. The Apostle Paul fled Corinth several times for Ephesus because Ephesus was safe and Corinth wasn't.
Mm.
And if you read 2 Corinthians 10 to 13, which you should never read as a pastor on Monday mornings, and you should never preach about it, is Paul was traumatized.
Yeah.
And I'm working on a book about this right now. And he was deeply wounded interpersonally. And
Mm.
he's sarcastic, he's ironical. He says he's not defending himself, but it's so obvious that he is. He calls them names. He labels people. All right. This is the sign of trauma. These are signs of trauma.
Yeah.
And traumatized people need safety. They need time. They need time away from the people who trigger them. And it's the only path forward for healing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not going to, they don't need to have Matthew 18 blown into their inbox and say, meet with this person now, or you're not a Christian.
Yeah.
They need someone who says, we need to go on a long walk and talk about what's happened to you. I want to hear your heart.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to squeeze in 30 seconds, one question that you just led into, which was, when is it, Matthew 18, you made a good point. That's where a lot of people get stuck in these hard situations, is you have to go confront. If they're unconfrontable, is it always a good idea to go to that person that you're offended with if it's a toxic leader that you may not win with?
Matthew 18 is one of the most abused texts in these contexts, and they are abused by narcissistic, power-mongering leaders constantly. Okay, Matthew 18 is about interpersonal dynamic breakdowns where two people can trust one another and have a conversation. And actually, it's safe enough that you can say, I think you were wrong on this. All right. But the power imbalance between a megachurch pastor or a pastor and an ordinary layperson, or even a staff member or a young staff member who is not at that level with that person, and almost no one is,
Yeah.
will almost always favor the person in power, and they will abuse their power and use their power to silence and suppress that person. Matthew 18, in other words, is largely an interpersonal formula for people who are largely equal in society or in their church or in their workplace. But it's not the recipe for an abusive pastor and a sexually abused woman
Yeah.
to confront the pastor. No, that's not the situation. That's a lose-lose situation. The pastor will lose his sanctification, and the woman who's been abused will lose her integrity or will lose her voice or agency and just capitulate and fawn and flop in front of this pastor. So it's a bad use of text. I mean, the other one is used is in the pastorals where it says, nothing should be done. You don't ever confront, let's say, a bishop or a leader without 2 or 3 witnesses to them. Well, how many times do pastors have sexual affairs with a woman and 2 or 3 people saw it? I mean, the chances there are 0.
Yeah.
So that's not a formula that's going to work all the time. And so both of those texts show up in our Tov book. We have little short discussions of these. Yeah. But Jenilee, you're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. Matthew 18 is always on the surface, and it's almost, I would say, in my experience of these in the last 3 or 4 years, mm-hmm. it's almost always the text is abused.
Yeah.
It's not for people of different structural powers. Spiritual abuse is what happens.
I agree with you. There was a time in a situation where my training with Matthew 18 would have made me feel compelled to go directly to the pastor or the perpetrator in my situation. And the Holy Spirit is the one that said no. And he reminded me of the passage in Proverbs that says, he who is given a trust must prove trustworthy. And that became a principle, that helped me differentiate. Have they proven trustworthy to respond in a responsible way to what I want to tell them? If not, then what's the next best healthy way to handle this? And it was typically having boundaries or removing myself from the situation. So,
the percentage of pastors, this is sad, who when confronted respond properly is not high.
No.
It's very low. And it's sad because these are pastors who preach the forgiveness of sins all the time.
Yeah.
Unless it involves that they have to confess their sins. And then they might just go total generalize. I'm suffering from pride right now. I mean, who doesn't agree with that sin, and who doesn't think that's characteristic of them, and who has any idea what that actually means?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's true. Well, you have shared so many things, and as anyone listening can tell, we have just scratched the surface, which is why you guys need to go get his book, A Church Called Tov. And it sounds like Pivot is a really valuable companion book to A Church Called Tov. Is there anything you would like to end with for my listeners that you would like to leave them with?
Well, no, it's just that maybe I could say you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
If you're suffering at the hands of abusive leaders, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, which is a crime, you're not alone. There are people out there who can join you in your experience and help you. And there are therapists who guide you through this. And there is healing down the road. But it's time to take the first step now.
Yeah.
That's so good. That's so good. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for joining us and for giving me a few extra minutes. I appreciate it. Stephen, you're a great co-host. Thanks for coming as well. And you guys, thanks so much for listening. Make sure you go grab Scot McKnight's books. He has quite a few to choose from, so go peruse and maybe grab all of them. But you can find his books on Amazon. And you guys have a wonderful week. Make sure you're subscribed to Java with Jen, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's show. Listen, let's stay connected. Come follow me on Instagram at Java with Jen, where you can follow the latest and say hey. It's a really great way to stay in touch. Many of you have also asked how you can support the show. You can make donations through the Anchor app or on Patreon, or of course by sharing, rating, and reviewing on social media and iTunes as well. Your heartfelt feedback always reminds me why I do this. Also, don't miss our merch store, where you can get super cool Java with Jen swag and coffee. Find it at javawithjenmerch.com. Until next time, remember, hearing God's voice is simple, and He wants to be a part of your everyday life. See you next week.